Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to have a chat with you about what I read in January of 2019. It was an extremely cold month here in Pittsburgh and a pretty busy one for me on a personal front since I just recently started my new job, which I'm happy to report is going very well. But starting a new job, training at a new job, that's at a different place and in sort of a different industry kind of feels like learning a new language, so it's been a little bit taxing. My reading month in January wasn't perfect, but it was pretty good under the circumstances, and it was certainly very colorful. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start off by talking about all those books that I have not talked about in any other video, and then I will move on to the one book that I have previously discussed elsewhere. The first book that I read in January was my pick off of my 5-star nonfiction predictions list video that I did back in Nonfiction November. That was The Raven Master, My Life with Ravens at the Tower of London by Christopher Scaife. This is a quick yet thoroughly enjoyable memoir written by the current Raven Master at the Tower of London, where they have kept the birds for generations. Why they keep the birds there is of no real purpose, but its origins is the stuff of legends, and the tradition is kept up more out of this ongoing lore than anything else. But to keep the birds at the tower, there must be a group of people in charge of caring for them, and chief among them is the very personable Raven Master Christopher Scaife. What's obvious from the very start is just how much Christopher Scaife cares for these birds. He's no ornithologist, but he is fascinated by them, and in the book he gives you plenty of scientific information about the ravens from credible sources. But what he does have is an abundance of up-close and personal experience with these birds. He describes each of the birds currently living at the tower, all of their personalities and quirks, since each of them really is an individual. He talks about his routine in caring for them and talks about simply what it's like to be around them. Mixed in with everything else is Scaife's own story of how he got to where he is today. Troubled teenage years led him to enlist in the military, where he had a successful career, but once he was done there, he applied for and nearly didn't get a position as a yeoman warder at the tower, and then he was eventually handed the reins of being the primary caretaker to this conspiracy of ravens. It's a nice personal touch that I wasn't expecting to be there, but it does add some human dimension to a book that's still very much all about the birds. Primarily, his job is to live and work at the tower, taking care of the ravens. But another added element of his job is to live and breathe the story of the place. And as a lover of history, it's kind of a natural extension of who Scaife is. Throughout the book, he refers to himself as a storyteller, and he certainly shows himself to be one, not just in his descriptions of the tours that he gives to the public as part of his job as a yeoman warder, but he describes the history of the tower to us in such an engaging and fascinating way, as well as giving us stories about each of the ravens in his care. Given what a bird nerd I am, there was very little chance that I wasn't going to love this book, but it certainly earned all of the 5 stars that I was expecting it to earn from me. It's a totally charming book that is both fun and informative, and now I want to go to the Tower of London. The next book I read in January was not as great of an experience. It was my pick off of the 10 most popular books on my TBR list that I've been trying to work my way through. That was Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. This is a fantasy book about a man living in London named Richard Mayhew. He has kind of a blasé life. He does have a good job and a stable relationship, although the girl he's with is cold and all wrong for him. But on the way out to an important dinner, he and his fiancée stumble upon a girl lying in the street, bleeding very badly, but this girl insists that she cannot be taken to a hospital because it is too dangerous. So, to the detriment of his romantic relationship, Richard skips this dinner and instead chooses to care for this girl in his apartment. As it turns out, she is a resident of London Below, a mystical world underneath the streets of London that you can only access if you are born into it or have fallen through the cracks of society in London Above. This girl is in trouble, running from assassins who have killed her entire family for unknown reasons. She is looking for safety, she is looking for answers, and Richard, of course, comes along for the ride. In general, I'm not the biggest reader of fantasy. I'm pretty married to the real world, so I don't have that exacting of standards when it comes to world building in a fantasy novel. But I do require there to be some. In this book, we're given what feels like less than no information about London Below. There's no lore about it whatsoever. Like, has it always been there? If not, who started it? Later in the book, we're led to believe that society in London Below has been fractured. Why? Since when? In case it's not obvious at this point, I'm personally of the opinion that if you're going to present such a big idea, you need to have answers to those questions. So much of this book makes absolutely no sense. Richard is transported to this world, but the entire time he is obsessed to getting back to his old life. Yet in the portions where we saw what his old life was like, it's portrayed as less than average. Why would you want to go back to it? And it's not even like he's lamenting the loss of anything specific or that he's saying that he misses his version of normal. He just pouts like a school-aged child, like, I want to go home. And while at times in this book I did like the dark tone to it, I did think it was really perfect for winter, he tried to inject whimsy where it really didn't belong. Like, really serious stuff is happening, like death, for instance, and he's trying to make the characters be silly. We're made to believe in this book that the assassins that they are running from are dangerous and should be feared. But the way they're written is nonsensical, and they're supposed to be funny. I don't like it. I think if something is going to be dark, then make it dark. If you want it to be whimsical, then make it whimsical. Of course, you can scatter in little bits of an opposite element into your book, but don't go trying to fuse together two things that clash. It's like a lollipop with razor blades in it. I'm going to hurt myself if I go in there looking for a sweet. And if I wanted a weapon, well, there's a much better way to go about making one. This whole book is a hodgepodge of badly threaded together daydreams that lacked planning and backstory. Okay, that's off my chest. The next book I read in January was a spontaneous selection. I picked it to help me build some momentum after I was getting very frustrated with my current reads. This is a book that I showed off in my latest nonfiction haul. That is The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating by Elizabeth Tova Bailey. This book is part memoir and part natural history, in which the author tells us about a time in her life when she was very seriously ill. She had acquired a mystery virus in Europe that doctors in the States could not identify, but that nearly took her life. She was bedridden for a very long period of time when she had previously been a very active young woman. A friend of hers came to visit her at this time when she was bedridden and brought her a little snail that they had found in the forest. And the friend didn't know it at the time, but over the next few months, this snail would become the author's companion as well as her entertainment, because since she was able to do very little else physically, she just observed the snail. She details this experience in this book, but also gives us a ton of scientific information about snails that she went on to gather after this most serious point in her illness. And it's just lovely. It was fascinating to read everything about the snails, but to hear about how this little tiny creature soothed her and took her mind off of her situation was so bittersweet to read about. I don't like to think back on this much, but there was a period in my life when I was very sick, not nearly as sick as the author. It turned out that it was my gallbladder, but in a very deceptive way, meaning that it appeared to be functional, and as a last resort, doctors decided to take it out, hoping that it would help, which it did. Being sick every single day with no end in sight, even on my reduced scale, is soul crushing. It makes you feel like you don't want to keep going on. You need things to make you want to keep going on. And for Bailey, it was this snail. It's such a touching little book. I highly recommend it. It will make you feel grateful for every day that you are healthy. The random book that I read off of my TBR this month was The Race to Save the Romanovs, which is historian Helen Rappaport's latest release on the Romanov family. She begins with a discussion of the fall of the Romanov dynasty, which she does pretty solely from their side of things. The churning of the revolution is largely left out, which was a little strange for me. I've never read an account of that period of time with those two things divorced from one another. But she wisely didn't waste time with a full account of the revolution because her focus is what the title says. It's about the efforts, or lack thereof, to rescue the 7 members of the Romanov family, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 4 daughters and 1 son, as well as the few companions that did not abandon them at the end. They were all murdered in Yekaterinburg in 1918. Let me just repeat that one more time, since some people get confused and then start to get musical about it. They were all brutally murdered in Yekaterinburg in 1918 after a long and humiliating period of imprisonment. Once it was revealed that the Bolsheviks had, in fact, murdered the Romanov family, which was kept under wraps for a while for political reasons, the world was in an uproar, looking to the monarchies of Europe like, why didn't you do something? This was particularly directed at King George V of England, who was the cousin of Nicholas II, although Nicholas had relatives in all of the monarchies in Europe, basically. But this book asks the questions, did anyone try to do anything to save the Romanov family? Was there anything that could have been done? Would the Romanov family have agreed to have been separated in order to ensure the survival of any of them? Rappaport did a ton of digging in the archives and did unearth some new information that gives a more complete look at the situation. Probably the most complete look we're ever going to get, since some things we just can't know, some things never would have been written down. Let me say that this is a very good book. It's extremely well researched and well written, but this is a book for those who are already familiar with the Romanov story. Its focus is so specific that a lot of other information that you would probably need to know is left out, and it's so full of nitty-gritty detail that it's likely not going to keep your attention unless you already know the basics. If you want a full account of Nicholas and Alexander's story, or if you want to learn more about the murder of the Romanov family, like if you're confused by an animated film, for instance, I cannot recommend the works of Robert K. Massey enough. I did an entire author profile on him quite a while ago on this channel. I will link that for you down below. So this is a very good book, but it's not for beginners. And the last book that I read off of my January TBR was a buddy read that I did with the lovely Andrea over at Infinite Text. Together we read the Enormous Lea Long, Forever Amber by Kathleen Winsor. This is historical fiction set in Restoration-era England, in which we follow Amber St. Clair, the bastard child of high-ranking but unmarried parents. She never knows her parentage, instead being raised in a small farm town. She is swept off her feet by a man named Bruce Carleton, who is passing through town. She falls in love with him and convinces him to take her along to London, which he only reluctantly agrees to, although he says he will never marry her. And so begins Amber's long journey of social climbing, scheming, and sleeping around for the next 10 years, all the while she is hopelessly pining for Bruce Carleton, who just can't seem to love her back. I was, while I was reading this book, and still am, so frustrated with this. On one hand, it's really fun to read. The writing is really zippy and lively, and it was super cool to get to see all these historical events and figures on the page. Like, we get to meet Charles II and many other members of the court. We get to meet his many mistresses. That was really cool. Amber goes through the plague. She sees the Great Fire of London. It's just really cool to see those things come to life here. But depth was absolutely sacrificed in favor of breadth in this novel. The author wanted to show so much. In fact, I read that the manuscript of this was so much longer than the still colossal finished novel. She forgot to dig deeper into anything. Character motivations are never clear in here. It actually made me feel a very similar frustration that I did with Neverwhere, in that in a novel, I want to be able to point at something, whether it be world building or a character's actions in this case, and ask why it's happening and feel like the writing is giving me a good answer. Like in this book, I kept wondering, why is Amber so obsessed with Bruce? And I couldn't think of a good answer to it. I also would have liked there to have been more of a statement to this book. Amber wants to climb and climb and climb the social hierarchy, but we start to see as readers that it's never going to be enough for her. Some ruminations on that would have been totally appropriate and would have added some much needed heft to this story. It also moves so fast that like my neck hurts from the whiplash. One second she's married to someone, the next she's not. On one page she's pregnant, like just finds out she's pregnant, and the next she's giving birth. This is not me being hyperbolic. That is actually how this goes. But then during the section on the plague, It is so long and drawn out. We hover over that section in such a noticeable way because it's so much slower paced than the rest of this book that it felt weird and stagnant. I don't know. Parts of this were enjoyable, but I'm honestly pretty mad that I spent the time reading a 1,000-page book just to be this peeved at the end of the experience. If you want a crazily paced 17th century soap opera, then this might be for you. But if you want any kind of depth to the stories that you read, seek it elsewhere. And then the last book I have to talk to you about in this video is one that I have previously discussed in another video, so I will only briefly touch upon it here. That is Once Upon a River by Diane Setterfield. I couldn't resist picking this one up since it was just recently released, and Diane Setterfield's earlier work, The 13th Tale, became one of my favorite fiction books of 2018. This is a faintly magical novel about two strangers, a man and a little girl, who make a late-night appearance at a tavern. The man is badly injured, and the little girl he's carrying in his arms appears to be dead until suddenly she comes back to life. The rest of this book asks the questions. Who are these people? What happened to them? And how did the little girl who was so clearly dead become almost magically restored to the living world? But there are themes in here on family and on change, and at the center of everything is the constantly flowing River Thames. I loved this book so much. I highly recommend it, and if you would like to hear more of my thoughts on it, I will link the full review that I did of it down below. I'm still currently reading a bunch of stuff that I intended to finish in January. I got really sick at the end of the month, and that kind of put a halt on all of my reading progress. But I am going to be attempting to finish up those books here at the beginning of the month before moving on to my February reading. But if you've read any of the books that I've talked about today, if you've heard of them, or if you want to read them after hearing me talk about them, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. You can put any other general comments or questions you have there as well, or you can reach me on a variety of different places on social media, and the links to all of my profiles are linked in the description box below. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.